In the final winter of 1944, much of the world seemed to pause, though few realized it at the time. Snow settled quietly over the forests of Europe, softening the outlines of a landscape already marked by years of war. Villages stood damaged but standing, their broken windows and empty streets, hinting at what had passed through them. For a brief moment, the stillness felt almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm, something was unfolding, deliberate, concealed, and gathering strength. What does the end of a war look like just before it refuses to end? And how many lives are drawn into one last attempt to change what can no longer be changed? This is the story of the Battle of the Bulge, not only as a military campaign but as a moment when the course of history seemed to hesitate, then surge once more. Before the offensive began, the Western Front had settled into a fragile balance. By late 1944, Allied forces had advanced deep into German-held territory. Paris had been liberated. The German army, once dominant across Europe, had been pushed back toward its own borders. For the first time in years, there was a sense, quiet but growing, that the war in Europe might be approaching its conclusion. In the villages scattered across the Ardennes, daily life continued in cautious routine. Farmers worked fields that had already seen armies come and go. Children moved along narrow roads between dense forests, their voices carrying faintly through the cold air. In the distance, the sound of artillery was still present, but it felt far away. For many American troops stationed there, the Ardennes was considered a relatively quiet sector. Some were new to the front. Others had been moved there to recover from earlier fighting. Letters home spoke of the approaching Christmas season, of snow-covered landscapes, and of a calm that felt at times almost normal. Few realized how quickly that calm would disappear. Far to the east, within German command, a different plan was taking shape. For Adolf Hitler, the situation was increasingly dire, but surrender was not something he would consider. Despite mounting losses and the steady advance of Allied forces, he remained focused on one final offensive, an operation designed to regain the initiative and force a political shift. The idea was bold and risky. German forces would strike through the Ardennes, a region the Allies did not expect to face a major attack. Dense forests and narrow roads would help conceal the buildup. Winter conditions would limit visibility. Surprise would be critical. The goal was to drive West Divide, British and American forces, and capture the port of Antwerp. If successful, it could disrupt Allied supply lines and create enough instability to force negotiations. It was a plan built on speed, coordination, and the hope that one decisive move could alter the course of the war. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, that plan was set in motion. Without warning, artillery fire broke the silence across the Ardennes. The sound carried through the forests, followed by the impact of shells striking American positions. What had been a quiet sector became a front line almost instantly. Soon after, German armored units advanced. Columns of tanks moved along snow-covered roads, supported by infantry pushing through wooded terrain and open ground. The attack was coordinated and forceful, overwhelming positions that had not been prepared for a large-scale assault. The effect was immediate. American units spread across the region struggled to respond. Communication was disrupted. Orders were delayed or lost. Some units found themselves cut off, facing an enemy that seemed to appear from all directions. The Allied front did not collapse entirely, but it was pushed back, unevenly, forming a large bulge in the line. That shape would give the battle its name. In warfare, momentum can be as important as numbers or equipment. It shapes decisions, affects morale, and often determines how events unfold. In the opening days, momentum was clearly with the German forces. Specialized units, some wearing captured American uniforms, moved behind Allied lines, creating confusion. Road signs were changed. False instructions circulated. Uncertainty spread among troops already dealing with a sudden and unexpected attack. Despite limited fuel supplies, German forces pushed forward as quickly as possible. Every mile gained increased the pressure on Allied positions and brought them closer to key objectives. But even in these early successes, there were signs of strain. The same winter conditions that helped conceal the advance also created difficulties. The cold affected both sides, slowing movement and complicating logistics. Equipment became harder to maintain. Supplies were delayed. As German units moved deeper, their supply lines stretched further. Resistance from Allied forces began to strengthen. The initial advantage, while significant, was not unlimited. The Allies, though surprised, were beginning to respond. At the center of the fighting was the town of Bastogne. Its location made it strategically important to crossroads that connected several key routes through the Ardennes. Control of Bastogne would influence movement across the region. American forces, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division, were moved into the town under difficult conditions. Many arrived with limited supplies and inadequate protection against the cold. There was little time to prepare. They established defensive positions as quickly as possible. Within days, German forces had surrounded Bastogne, cutting off access and isolating the defenders. The town came under sustained pressure with limited food, ammunition and medical resources available. At one point, German commanders sent a message calling for surrender. The reply from the American side was brief: nuts. The response was informal, but its meaning was clear. The defenders would hold their position. Inside Bastogne, conditions remained difficult. Soldiers dealt with freezing temperatures, constant pressure and uncertainty about when relief might arrive. Medical teams worked continuously with limited resources. Outside the town, German forces maintained their encirclement. But the situation was beginning to change. To the south, the U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton began a rapid movement northward. Redirecting forces in winter conditions was a complex operation requiring coordination and speed. The goal was to reach Bastogne and break the encirclement. Movement was slowed by weather and terrain, but the advance continued. On December 26, American forces reached Bastogne, opening a route into the town and easing the pressure on its defenders. The siege had been broken. Around the same time, weather conditions began to improve. As skies cleared, Allied air forces were able to operate more effectively. Aircraft targeted German supply lines, transport routes and positions that had previously been difficult to reach. This shift had a significant impact. German forces, already facing logistical challenges, now had to contend with increased pressure from the air. Movement became more difficult. Supplies became more limited. The balance began to shift. Allied units launched counterattacks, gradually pushing back against German positions. The bulge in the front line began to contract as control was regained. What had started as a strong offensive became increasingly difficult to sustain. For Germany, the operation required resources that could not easily be replaced. Armored units took losses. Equipment was left behind or destroyed. Experienced personnel were lost. The effort to regain momentum had instead accelerated its decline. Behind the movement of armies, there were individuals, experiencing the conflict in very different ways. An American soldier, still new to combat, remained in position. Through long cold nights, focusing on simple tasks and waiting for orders. Thoughts of home provided some comfort even as conditions remained uncertain. A German crew member, part of an armored unit, continued forward under pressure, aware that retreat was not a simple option and that each advance carried its own risks. In nearby towns, civilians stayed close to what remained of their homes, adapting to shifting control and ongoing disruption, uncertain how long the fighting would continue. The experience of the battle was not the same for everyone, but it affected all who were present. There were also moments that reflected the darker realities of the conflict. Incidents such as the killings near Malmedy underscored the brutality that could still emerge even in the final stages of the war. As January 1945 approached, the outcome of the offensive became clear. German forces were no longer advancing. The bulge had been reduced. The initiative had returned to the Allies. The offensive had failed. The cost was significant on both sides. Units were depleted. Equipment was lost. Many who had taken part would carry the experience with them long after the fighting ended. For Germany, the impact was especially severe. The loss of armored strength and trained personnel further limited its ability to continue large-scale operations. For the Allies, the victory confirmed their position and opened the way for continued advance into Germany. Beyond the battlefield, the effects were felt more widely. The ability of Allied forces to respond, reorganize, and counterattack reinforced the strength of their coordination. The outcome also contributed to the broader collapse of German military capacity in the West. Within Germany, the consequences of the failed offensive added to existing pressures. Resources had been committed to a final effort that did not succeed. Civilian populations continued to experience shortages and ongoing disruption. Among soldiers on both sides, there was a growing awareness that the conflict in Europe was entering its final phase. Resistance movements across occupied territories gained confidence as German positions weakened. The broader direction of the war was no longer in question. Even so, the situation remained complex. Within German leadership, differences of opinion became more apparent. Some recognized the limited options remaining, while others continued to support ongoing resistance. Among Allied forces, there were also questions about decisions made during the battle, about the cost of the campaign, and about what would come next. War, even as it approaches its end, rarely becomes simple. Today, the Ardennes appears much as it did before the battle: forests, quiet roads, small towns rebuilt over time. Snow still falls in winter, covering the ground in a familiar way. Visitors move through the region, often unaware of the specific locations. where key moments unfolded. But the history remains part of the landscape. The Battle of the Bulge influenced the final stages of the war in Europe. It demonstrated both the risks of underestimating an opponent and the importance of resilience under pressure. It also showed how quickly conditions can change even when an outcome seems near. The battle stands as a reminder that the closing phases of a conflict can be among the most intense events in the Ardennes, shaped not only military planning but also the understanding of how wars conclude through a series of shifts, rather than a single decisive moment. The soldiers who fought there did not have the benefit of that perspective. They focused on immediate challenges, holding positions following orders, enduring conditions. Their actions taken day by day contributed to a larger outcome that only became clear later. Looking back, the winter of 1944 reveals more than a single campaign. It shows a moment when the expected end of a war was delayed by one final effort to change its course. A moment when the outcome depended not only on strategy but on the ability of individuals to respond under pressure. And as the snow settled again over the Ardennes, the signs of battle gradually faded from view, not removed but absorbed into the landscape, part of a history that remains even when it is no longer visible.